This week for Album Swap, I recommended Joe Silent Shout by The Knife. I predict that Joe will give this album a 9 out of 10.
Silent Shout by The Knife is their third studio album, and The Knife are like a synth pop outfit. It's very experimental synth pop, especially with a lot of the effects they use on the vocals. And the only other Knife album I'd listened to before this is Shaking the Habitual, which I love. I think it's easily one of the best records of the 2010s. I think it's really fantastic. I love the atmosphere that's built up within that record and how dark and interesting everything sounds. I have to say, I didn't like this album nearly as much as Shaking the Habitual. I feel like it just doesn't build the same atmosphere that Shaking the Habitual does. Tracks on here, I think a lot of them are good. A lot of them just don't have something that pulls them into being so amazing to me. One of my favorite tracks, personally, is We Share Our Mother's Health. Probably my favorite track. It's so catchy. It has this amazing, super bouncy beat to it. The distortion on the vocals at the end of the track is really cool, and I really love that track. But I guess there wasn't anything else on the album that really did that for me. There's a lot of good songs, but nothing that was like dark and interesting as a lot of the stuff I love on Shaking the Habitual. There are songs like The Captain. It has these really interesting metallic synth noises on a lot of it, but I also think it kind of goes on too long, even with like the second half and the really catchy hook on that. Again, there's a lot of good stuff on this album, but a lot of it just didn't really do that much for me. There's a track like Na Na Na, which to me kind of just sounds like the water temple music from a Zelda game. Or you have, say, From Off to On. It's just a very quiet track and nothing really jumped out about it to me. There's like interesting lyrics on it, and I think that's also something throughout this album I think is very strong, are the lyrical themes, and a lot of what it explores is really interesting. I'm not actually sure. The final track on the album, I want to ask you, it made it seemed to me like it was a concept album, and I didn't get that from it because it seems to be somewhat a continuation from the previous track, but I'm not sure. So
I never interpreted this album as a concept album, although I understand what you're saying here. It is weird. I think it could be interpreted as a concept album, but I personally don't think that there is a strong enough story going throughout where that is the case.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of what I got, was that specifically the last two tracks I felt like led into each other with their lyrical themes. Like one hit is kind of about like domestic abuse, pretty much. Also the Godfather reference on one hit kind of came out of nowhere, and I was like, wait, what? But I think it works really well. And then Still White, it seems to be a continuation of that, where the narrator or whoever is now like in the hospital. It's interesting because the other tracks didn't really seem to connect too much despite that.
I guess as a general response to what you've been saying, I prefer Silent Shout over Shaking the Habitual personally. I find that Silent Shout is a lot more punchier with a lot of its songs, and I really enjoy that. This album is just very fun. It's very nice to have on, whereas Shaking the Habitual, there's a lot there, and it's a lot to get into, I think. I have my problems with that album that I'm not going to go into now, but I do think that there are just a lot of really great songs. I agree with you. We Share Our Mother's Health is probably my favorite song off this album. One of my favorite The Knife songs of their entire discography. I also agree that I think the lyrical themes throughout this album are fantastic. There's a lot of vignettes here that I think are really interesting, especially when put together. I think if you look into the lyrics a lot and you try and draw conclusions from them, there are actually a lot of conclusions to be drawn.
Basically what I've gotten out of this is that I really love The Knife because of the atmosphere that they often build, and you really like The Knife because of their catchy and punchy sounding songs. This week for Album Swap, I recommended Brendan the album Locust Abortion Technician by the Butthole Surfers. I really honestly don't know. I'm gonna say a 7.5. That's what I predict, I guess.
So today I am reviewing Locust Abortion Technician by Butthole Surfers. This is the band's third studio album, coming out in 1987. This is an experimental and avant-garde noise rock album. Butthole Surfers are credited with being an influence on the grunge sound that arrived in the early 90s. You can definitely see where that comes from on this album. And just for reference, this album and Butthole Surfers' debut EP are both listed on Kurt Cobain's top 50 albums of all time list. This album has a lot of very good songs on it. It starts right out the gate with Sweat Loaf. Every time I say a name of something in this review, it's gonna sound like I'm crazy. And that's kind of the point of this album, I guess. But yes, Sweat Loaf, the opening song on this album, very, very good starting track, I think. It comes right out of the gate. It has this really sweet guitar riff, which is a tribute to actually a Black Sabbath riff from their song Sweet Leaf. And they have these very avant-garde, distorted vocals, and I think it works really well within the track. This track is also by far the longest track on the album, and I think it actually sets the tone quite well. I really like how experimental and avant-garde this album gets. I think there are points where it gets a bit too much, and I'll talk about that later. But I think for the most part, the experimentation on this album really does work out. And there are a lot of very creative ideas presented here, especially for the time. And I think that the experimentation on this album works much better than on previous Butthole Surfers albums as well. Also, the guitar on this album, just the guitar work in general, way better than on previous albums, I think. The guitar is way more catchy and memorable in a lot of these songs, which is quite nice. The vocals are very cool on this record. The lyricism is often simplistic or gibberish, but if you're going to a Butthole Surfers record to get some deep meaning, you are going to the wrong place. I should say that. Just the vocals and how they sound, their delivery, and the effects that are being put on them throughout the album, I think are pretty cool. There's also some very catchy moments, like on Human Cannonball or the Omen. The Omen is just gibberish, but it's catchy gibberish. If you would like to comment, Joe.
But one of the things that I enjoy the most about this album is that attitude that they have of just, screw it. Let's just make this weird music, and they don't care what anyone else thinks of what they're doing. It's just it's just them having fun with what they're creating, and that's what's so entertaining about it, because it's a song like Sweat Loaf, which uses the riff from Sweet Leaf, it's so stupid but so much fun, and that's what I love about it. So
yeah, in my opinion, there are some weaker aspects to this album, however, because it's just the band having fun and sort of going all over the place. The album, I think, lacks that cohesive listening experience that I'm really looking for in terms of listening to an album. I like a lot of these songs off this album, but the album as a whole isn't really consistent in any way. And there are times where I think the experimentation doesn't really work out. For me, Hey or Cunts, not huge fans of those tracks. Closing track on this album, 22 going on 23, also I just don't think works. I think it's actually quite possibly the weakest track on this album, and kind of unfortunate for it to be the closer, I think. For the most part, definitely solid. There's a lot more good than bad here, I'll say that, if you would like to throw in some comments.
I can definitely see where you're coming from about it not being consistent at all. I guess for me what holds it together is, again, their attitude of not really caring and just experimenting, and that weird experimentation, because it's just on all of the tracks, for me that brings everything together. But I definitely understand why someone might think it's kind of just random ideas they had. Silent Shout by the Knife, I think, is a very solid record. There's some songs on here that I really love, but for the most part, I just like all the songs on here. Maybe with a couple of exceptions, I don't really enjoy Nah. But I guess for me, it's kind of lacking in the atmosphere that I really loved on Shaking the Habitual. And I think that's the main thing that holds it back for me. Most of the songs, again, very good. There's some really interesting experimentation, and like the choices with the vocals a lot of the time are super interesting. But it just wasn't like as amazing as Shaking the Habitual was for me. I'd give this record a 7 out of 10. I'd recommend it. If you didn't like Shaking the Habitual, maybe you'd like this record.
As for Locust Abortion Technician by Butthole Surfers, I'm definitely a fan of this album. It lacks consistency and it doesn't have that album listening experience I'm really looking for. But again, there's just a lot of good stuff going on here, and I think that really makes up for that. I'm at an 8 on this album. I definitely would recommend it, especially if you're into more noisy and off-the-wall music.
Hey, like and subscribe this video if you like it. If you don't like it, please still like it. We need help.